Wilt Chamberlain fascinates me more than any other player in NBA history. Half the stories that surround him sound more fake than fact, and honestly, some of them absolutely are. But more interesting than the stories are the stats because we all acknowledge just how absurd they are. I mean, 50 points a night for an entire season? That's crazy. But oftentimes I think we don't appreciate just how absurd it is because we don't have a perspective for it. So today, let's do a bit of visualizing. Let's actually start with that talk about scoring. Here's the list for the 10 highest scoring players in the NBA last season. Luka Doncic led the league with 2,143 points, which is actually a pretty low number for recent seasons, courtesy of many top players suffering serious injuries. And here is Wilt's 7th highest scoring season in comparison, and then the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st. The only year in NBA history where a player eclipsed 4,000 points scored. But this is ignoring a pretty vital aspect of scoring, being efficiency. For this video, we'll be looking at efficiency via field goal percentage and true shooting percentage. The former hurts modern guards like Luka or Harden who shoot a lot of threes, which obviously brings down their overall field goal percentage. While the latter hurts guys like Wilt and Shaq by not properly reflecting how dominant they were in terms of getting straight buckets, as true shooting percentage values free throws. And if you didn't know, these guys were really bad at that aspect of the game. Also, these numbers are relative to league average because the NBA has gotten a lot better at scoring the basketball as time has gone on. Here's the 10 scoring leaders from this season in terms of total points with true shooting percentage factored in, and here's where Wilt ranks among them. Obviously well above them in terms of pure scoring and is still very efficient, but not to an all-time level like Shea, Jokic, and even KD. Wilt catches up to Shea and Jokic when we switch to field goal percentage with the best individual season efficiency-wise in 1966, being an incredible 11% above league average. Still, Jokic more than holds his own at 9.8% and Shea sits at 8.2%, an absurd mark for a guard. But let's be honest, this isn't a fair comparison. This is a list of every scoring champion in NBA history. The early NBA stands out for particularly low scoring numbers, partly due to a shorter schedule, partly because they were learning how to play basketball. You can see the peaks of Jordan, Kobe, and Harden stick out quite clearly, and of course, the early 60s belongs to our man of interest. And here's true shooting percentage added in. Clumping near the back, you have your low efficiency, high volume scorers like Pete Maravich, Russell Westbrook, and Allen Iverson. The average here sits at about 5%, which Wilt's 2 best seasons actually sit a little bit above. And over here we have some of the most efficient scoring seasons ever. George Mikan probably looked like an alien to guys in the 1950s, Adrian Dantley, though lacking team success, is still one of the most underrated scorers to ever live, and Kareem, well, you know all about him. But above all sits 2016 Stephen Curry, the greatest offensive season of all time. When we switch over to field goal percentage, the overall average drops, and quite a few more guys like Kobe and Harden fall into the inefficient group. Again, this way of measuring things hurts guards who took a medium to high volume of threes. But guess who it doesn't hurt? This guy. Shaq soars to the top of this list, nearly toppling Kareem, who is now number 1, and surpassing Wilt, who sits 3rd. So clearly this guy is a bum and his peak scoring seasons are overrated. Right? Well, consider this. In 1962, Wilt took nearly 40 shots a night and played more minutes than are in a game and still found himself shooting 8% better than the league average. Just think about how absurd that is. Everybody knew where the ball was going and they couldn't do a single thing about it. And if you're wondering, no. Bill Russell did not shut down Wilt. That is a myth. If Wilt had wanted to and tuned down his scoring to 30 a night, he would have been the most efficient player to ever live, at least in terms of pure field goals. And I'm not saying that for no reason. Going back to that true shooting percentage graph, Stephen Curry is sitting all pretty by himself with nearly 2,400 points at 12.8% above league average. And here is 1967 Wilt Chamberlain, about 400 points behind and 1.6% more efficient than a guy who is doing this. Flipping back to the field goal percentage, this is the updated graph with that season from Wilt. Can you notice where that dot was added? No? Alright, I'll help you out a little bit. It's all the way over here. In fact, if you take the rest of Wilt's career, minus his injury-shortened 1970 campaign, this graph updates to look like this. Now, I can already hear what some of you guys are saying. This is a cherry-picked stat, and if you picked any highly efficient, low-volume season from a great big man, you'd get the same result. And okay, that's a pretty fair line of thought. What big man did you have in mind? Was it Kareem? Or maybe it was Shaq? Or how about Jokic? He's pretty great. If you look at the most efficient seasons ever, you'll see a list infested with a bunch of rim runners and Wilt Chamberlain, having to scroll down to the 51st spot to find the next all-time talent in Jokic. The fact is that at his peak, nobody has ever come remotely close to scoring at the level of Wilt Chamberlain. When he toned down his scoring and focused on highly efficient looks and facilitating, he produced seasons that once again, nobody has ever come remotely close to replicating. Let's stick with the idea of scoring for a little bit longer. Shea made headlines this year by breaking a long-standing Wilt record for the most consecutive regular season games of 20 points or more. The top 5 for that streak goes like this. Jordan and Durant are tied for 5th with 72, then a little jump to Oscar Robertson at 79, an even bigger jump to Wilt at 92, before a massive jump to himself once again at 126, with Shea currently sitting at 140. Very impressive for all players named. But what about consecutive 30-point games? Well, Embiid racked up 22 in his dominant but injury-riddled 23-24 campaign. Then Wilt had 2 separate streaks of 25 and 31 in 1960 and 62 respectively, before we get to James Harden, who managed to record 32 in his historic 18-19 season. Oh, and then there's Wilt again, at a modest 61, almost as much as the next 2 spots put together. How about 40? Well, Kobe and Jordan both have streaks of 9, and then it goes Wilts, and Wilt. 50? In descending order this time, it goes Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt Chamberlain, Kobe Bryant, and Wilt Chamberlain. Oh, but he surely didn't record multiple 60-point games in a row. Right? Well, actually he did. In 1961, he had back-to-back 60-point games. The following year, he did that same thing again. And then he also had a streak of 3 60-point games in a row. He then topped it all off with a streak of 4 consecutive 60-point games. And you'll never guess how that streak ended. Alright, message received, this guy was pretty good at scoring. Let's take a break from that stat and look at rebounding, which if you didn't know, Wilt was also pretty good at. Now, rebounding in the 1960s was a lot different than it is today because the game contained a whole lot of... The pace was at an all-time level, and players took more shots than ever while lacking the shooting talent to efficiently get buckets. All of this led to a league that was sometimes averaging as many as 70 rebounds a night, while today no team is even cracking 50. In spite of that, the only guy in the same zip code as Wilt as far as rebounding was Bill Russell, who is second in most rebounding-related stats, but still falls a bit behind Wilt. To prove that point, here's the 25 highest total rebounding seasons in NBA history. Take a wild guess at how many of these aren't either Wilt or Bill. Got your guesses in? Well, it's Bob Pettit right here, and Jerry Lucas here, and here. The other 21 times are between 2 guys. Alright, here's the second part of this. Guess which ones belong to Wilt and which ones belong to Bill. Surely they're pretty evenly distributed, right? Well, here's Bill's seasons, and here's Wilt's seasons. That's right, the 7 highest single rebounding seasons ever belong to one man. In terms of single games, there have been 24 separate times where a player has eclipsed 40 rebounds in a single night. So here's the list. Congratulations to Jerry Lucas and Nate Thurmond, you guys are underrated dogs in league history. And then here's Bill at 8 and Wilt at 14, more than everybody else in league history put together. Okay, I know I said we'll take a break from scoring, but you just can't with this guy, so let's combine points and rebounds. So this graph measures the number of 30-30 games that have happened in NBA history. That's 30 points and 30 rebounds in a single night. So here with a strong count of 32, we have literally everybody not named Wilt Chamberlain, and on the other side here is Wilt Chamberlain. So now here's every 40-40 game Wilt ever had. That's 40 points and 40 rebounds in a single night. And here is every other game of the sort ever in 3, 2, 1... Oh yeah, nobody else has ever done that. Going to a regular double-double, that's 10 of at least 2 statistics, there isn't really a large amount of data available online. What we do know is that Wilt of course holds the record overall. Post-merger, Domantas Sabonis recently set the record with a highly impressive 61 consecutive games. Wilt meanwhile had a streak of 133 games. And 220, and 227. Another thing Wilt really enjoyed was sending the ball into the stands. Now, like all of these numbers, they are era dependent, and his blocks per game wasn't even an officially tracked stat by the NBA. With that being said, Basketball Reference recently added to Wilt's final season a tally of 446 blocks, which slots right here on the all-time leaderboard. We also have data that in a 112 game sample size, Wilt averaged 8.8 a night. If you were to average that out to a full 82 game season, it would look like this on the graph. But let's take that a step further and average it out across his entire career. The current top 5 is Tim Duncan, Mark Eaton, Kareem, who would have absolutely had more if they were tracked in his first 2 seasons in the league, Dikembe Mutombo, and with a massive lead over everyone else, we have Hakeem Olajuwon. And here's this hypothetical Wilt Chamberlain. For the last section of this video, I want to simply compare Wilt's all-time placements to his own era to really hammer in just how dominant he was. Firstly, Wilt played a very long time considering the circumstances of the early NBA. Here's a graph that contains the top 10 leaders in minutes played and games played as of 1973. If you guys like Oscar Robertson and Bill Russell appear on both, while others like Jerry West and John Havlicek only appeared on one. Wilt's former teammate Hal Greer sits comfortably as the all-time leader in games played as well as 4th in all-time minutes. Bill and Oscar also managed to eclipse 40,000 minutes of playing time in their careers. And all the way over here is Wilt, who retired 3rd on the games played list and number 1 in minutes played by nearly 8,000 10,000. In what will be the only graph today that Wilt doesn't stand out, we have the top 11 assist leaders as of 1973. Wilt is this dot right here and was 6th all time. Slightly ahead of all these other guys, but clearly behind the likes of Jerry West, Lenny Wilkins, Guy Rogers, and Bob Cousy. And then Oscar Robertson is way over here in his own league. Still, I wanted to highlight that a center managed to crack the top 10 in assists at one point in NBA history. A fact made even more impressive considering the typical mold that positions were usually limited to prior to the past decade. For reference, Jokic recently became the all-time leader in assists for a center, and compared to the modern top 10 list, he fits about right here. Also, I want to mention that right here is Bill Russell, just outside the top 10. If you didn't believe me when I said Wilt and Bill owned rebounding, well then check this one out. These were the top 8 rebounders in league history by 1973, and the only ones to surpass 10,000. The gap between the highest and the lowest on this list is only about 3,400. And then all the way over here is Bill Russell, a full 8,000 rebounds ahead of third place Walt Bellamy. And then 2,000 ahead of him is where we have Wilt. There will never be anyone to come close to touching Russell's second place career finish, let alone Wilt's first place finish. Here's the current top 10, and despite having hundreds of games on Bill and Wilt, nobody is even within 4,000 of them. And to round things up, here was the all-time scoring list upon Wilt's retirement. 5 players had surpassed 20,000 points to this point in NBA history, and we see a pretty steady progression up until Oscar Robertson at 25,822 points. And then there's this massive gap between him and you-know-who. To put this into perspective, the gap between Wilt and Oscar is about 5,500 points. The current gap between LeBron and Kareem is only about 5,000. More than that, the current 10th all-time in points, which is Shaq, scored about 65% of LeBron's current point total. Bailey Howell, who was 10th in 1973, scored about 56% of what Wilt had scored. All of these stats aren't meant to make you believe that Wilt is the GOAT because context matters and there are other things more important than statistical achievements. Instead, it's simply meant to reflect the stranglehold Wilt had over so many all-time records, many of which still stand today. A hold that gives many people a valid reason to consider him the most dominant player in NBA history. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing, as only a small percentage of you are, and also checking out this last video going over Chris Paul and his various career misfortunes. Have a great day, everybody.